Hi, Rasa. Hi, Rasa. Can you hear me?
Hello.
Hi.
Hello. I'm okay.
Great. Do you want to see if you can share your slides because I made you co-host?
Okay, sure. Okay, so open and then okay. Oh, let's like that, and then share screen. This.
Great.
Yeah.
That's good. Perfect. Perfect. So, and just give me a clue on how to pronounce your name properly.
It's Rasa Kamarauskaite, but I think you did it right. So.
So Rauskaite. Rauskaite.
Thank you. I wasn't sure. Yeah, I didn't know how to like explain it. And
no, I understand completely. And are you Lithuanian?
Yeah. Yeah.
Great. So we're going to start normally a couple of minutes after the hour. Okay. Yeah. We have a hard deadline at 1 o'clock. You've been on here before, so you know the drill. I'll give you about half an hour, and then we'll take questions, comments. So thank you so much for doing this.
No problem. I think it's not gonna take half an hour, I think. I've practiced it a few times. The longest I got was 21 minutes, but I think if I get a bit stressed out, it's gonna accelerate as well. So
that's just fine. That's just fine. Take as long as you want.
Sure.
It's me putting on the Princeton thing.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning for some. And welcome to QPW number 31 in our Queer Politics webinar series brought to you based out of Princeton University and with the largesse of everybody in the community around the world who's interested in studying these issues. Thank you so much for being with us today again. We've had a few regrets from people who are at the Midwest Political Science Association meetings in Chicago, but not in Chicago online. So we're missing a few people today, but nevertheless, we're going to have a great presentation and discussion about Eastern European, Northern European dimensions of LGBTQ politics rights. If you're new to the webinar, let me just remind you about some of our structures. We're going to take the first half of the hour to hear our presentation today, who I'll introduce in a second. And then in the second half, we will take any questions, any comments, any discussion. It would be fabulous if you at any point would just send me a chat message telling me you would like to be on the question list. You do not have to tell me what your question is. I would prefer to not know what your question is, but just let me put your name on the list so I can line people up for the second half of this hour. Also, if you are able, we would love for you to turn your webcam on. It's always nice to have an audience of faces for the presenter. So if you would stick your webcams on, if you're able and willing, that would be super. Thank you so much. Obviously, if you can't, then that's fine too. Before I get going with today, I should remind you that we have a slightly different event next week in the same time period, and it's going to be on a slightly different platform. That is a panel of leading women who identify as bisexual or pansexual, who have been or are in parliaments around the world, and their experiences. So right now we're featuring State Senator Sarah McBride from Delaware. We're featuring former California 25th Representative Katie Hill, and we have Senator Annie Hui from Ireland, and we have Nadia Whitome from the Labour Party in the United Kingdom. We're also hoping for Charlotte Nichols, who is also a Labour Party member in the United Kingdom, to join us as well, and perhaps a couple of others. So we'll be having a discussion in a webinar format where, because we're expecting many more people, you will see the panelists be able to ask questions, but the rest of the audience will be hidden in that webinar format. So without further ado, let me start off today's session which is, again, a fabulous new frontier for many of us to think about LGBTQ issues and representation and rights around the world. Rasa Kamarauskaite is a PhD candidate at University College London in the School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies. She herself is from Lithuania and studies the intersections of gender and sexuality in Lithuania and post-conflict, post-communist countries as well. So today she's going to be talking to us about the way people navigate in Lithuania, their queer identities, the way society and politics react to those identities, and the strategic positioning of pressures for rights in those countries. So without further ado, let me thank and welcome Rasa with us today. And as I said, if you have any questions, send me a chat message with your name and I'll add you to the list. So take it away, Rasa.
Wow, that was such an introduction. I think my presentation is much more modest than the introduction was. But as it was mentioned, I'm a PhD student at School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies. And the focus of my thesis is actually everyday visibilities and invisibilities of homosexual, bisexual people in Lithuania. So it's not so much, I'm not focused so much about LGBT politics per se. But when I was doing my fieldwork in Lithuania and collecting interviews and spending time with people, I also met up with a lot of activists, and I heard their opinions about how to progress with LGBT rights in Lithuania. And this is what I would like to talk about today. I just have to say that this is not a very well-developed argument that I'm sharing. It's just rather some ideas that I have on very initial ideas, I would say, about the material that I have encountered, the data that I have collected regarding LGBT visibility and LGBT rights in Lithuania from the most prominent activists in Lithuania, I would have to say. And so I would very much appreciate your comments and your feedback, you know, where I should maybe look further to develop these ideas, and also about the shortcomings of my ideas as well. So thank you very much. So in terms of the structure of the presentation, so I would like to share some data, as I was saying, regarding LGBT inclusion in Lithuania, and to discuss its possible implications. So first, I will introduce the prevalent discourses about LGBT in Lithuania in general that were very much prevalent, and I still think to some extent are still prevalent in Lithuania. And I would argue that these discourses actually function as strategies of alienation, especially by anti-LGBT groups. Then I'll present and discuss the response from LGBT activists regarding these alienating discourses, and I would call that strategies of inclusion. And finally, in the end, I'll just raise some questions for further inquiry about this whole phenomenon that is happening in Lithuania right now. So first, I would like to give you some context regarding the image of LGBT in Lithuania, especially the image that was very prevalent before the first Baltic Pride that happened in 2010 in Lithuania. So basically, when the LGBT NGOs of fighting for LGBT rights in Lithuania approached the local government to ask for permission to organize Baltic Pride in Vilnius in 2010, the then mayor of Vilnius expressed his opinion and said that Lithuanian LGBT organizations constitute, I quote, a small group of people who acquire material gain from the West, and through escalating discrimination and initiating conflicts and promoting propaganda, they achieve this gain, basically. This kind of idea was also promoted by some of the media and anti-Pride opposition were, so there were marches organized with banners saying like, stop propaganda of sexual debauchees. Also some illustrations in some media appeared depicting basically almost naked, supposedly gay men taking over the world and so on. So this was happening very much in 2010 before the first gay pride. And yeah, so there was more slogans as God save Lithuania, the nation, and the Lithuanian Christian family. And also saying like no to fuckers and similar things. So I was I have started to think why to choose like debauchery and foreignness, being foreign, as kind of mobilizing mobilizing concepts to form anti-LGBT movement. And I was thinking that it could be to some extent explained by the role of the Catholic Church that it used to have and still has in Lithuania. And in Catholic Church's role in building modern Lithuanian national identity. So basically, the Catholic Church was one of the main organizations that unified anti-Soviet activism in Lithuanian SSR. And this kind of religious nationalism proved to be the most efficient means in facilitating social cohesion in the newly created and freed Lithuanian nation state. And as there basically were no other viable alternatives in terms of building up one's national identity, it was never challenged. So although only 15% of Lithuanians attend church on a regular basis and observe Catholic faith and Catholic rituals, due to the church's involvement in the independence movement, church still plays an important ideological and political role in the country, especially when it comes to terms of the nation, the morals, and survival of the nation, so to speak. So basically, the values promoted by the Catholic Church became synonymous with the national values, including the teachings about the family as being based on a union between a man and a woman, and in general, very conservative views about sexuality, which should be tied to procreation and should be kept in the private sphere of the home and general kind of public display of modesty, so to speak. So basically, I think that these Catholic values in Lithuania are very much seen as the values of the nation, the only values of the nation. So anything that comes outside of that is not seen, is not deemed as part of the nation and the society. So I think it was quite a strategic move of anti-LGBT groups to emphasize uncontrollable sexuality of LGBT people, because in that case, it kind of automatically points at their alleged ties to the West. And it's a good argument to show that these people are not part of the Lithuanian nation. Right, so if Lithuanians are debaucherous, which means that they're not Catholic and they do not adhere to Catholic rules, because these rules are seen as Catholic, not as generally ethical or have some form of ethics, but Catholic, namely. And therefore Lithuanian LGBT people are foreign, they are not Lithuanian. The organizations, LGBT NGOs in Lithuania tackled the question of modesty and nudity straight from the beginning. So Lithuanian Gay League is the oldest LGBT NGO in Lithuania, and they are the they are mostly in charge of organizing Baltic Prides in Lithuania. And the president of the organization publicly said that this will be a peaceful march of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transsexual citizens, their families and friends. And I can guarantee you that you will not see any nudity during the march. So this kind of appropriateness and modesty was kind of tackled right away, which I will discuss a little bit more later. In fact, his ideas were shared by other, a little bit smaller LGBT NGOs in Lithuania, and a member of a lesbian collective, which is called Gender Wrongs, who organized parties in Lithuania, expressed the genuine need to change LGBT bar culture, for example. So she was saying that when she first encountered lesbian and gay bars in Lithuania, I quote, that she found out that women used to allow themselves a lot. There were fights in the bar and broken glasses and all that body cult everywhere. And from that experience, she used to feel ashamed of the community because, in her words, it does not present homosexual people as people who have values. So again, this value question and like presenting yourself and the community as people who have values, but you know, when they say values, they have idea of a like certain values, right? So they genuinely felt that this is something that needs to change within community as well, because it produces a bad image to the rest of the society and is bad for the community as it is for itself. And these girls, basically, they decided to organize different kind of events as an alternative to these debaucherous, rowdy bars. And they were saying that we make each party in a different, well-known venue. It never happens in some unknown basement. I think it helps to promote LGBT visibility and to break some myths and stereotypes. Because people have some negative ideas about how LGBT people look and behave. So basically, through these parties, I think they are trying to create a space where kind of society and the real, I put it in kind of inverted commas, LGBT people can interact and meet, and through that, it would help to debunk the myth of LGBT decadence. I kind of put them in inverted commas because the question of real and the myth, I think it's quite not as straightforward as they would try to say. However, I have to say that this group quite literally and figuratively bring LGBT people to the city center, because those parties happen in well-known bars in the old town. They are open, everybody can come in and so on. So they kind of aiming at this meeting up of LGBT and the society. Right. Okay. So, however, I think that the parties kind of prioritize bringing people together and somewhat downplay the importance of sexual orientation or sexuality or expression of sexuality in this context, because they were saying like the main idea of the parties is that they are open, where people can come together, not necessarily LGBT, but everyone who is LGBT friendly. There are many people who support LGBT. The young hipster generation is not bothered with the question of sexual orientation whatsoever. They just want to have a good party. So the priority here and the priority of this party is not to create kind of a safe space for the community as such, where they could have like, you know, be together and grow and things like that, but more to be open and become part of this wider Lithuanian society or the wider city, basically. And that is more important than creating something just for the community, basically. Another well-known LGBT activist, Dominykas Vaitiekūnas, who is a TV persona, openly gay TV persona, an actor, and also a singer, also shared similar opinions with me about over-sexualized image of homosexual men in Lithuania. So when I was talking to him, he was saying that I think that until I have come out, the image of a homosexual man was very narrow. And when I asked him what he meant by that, he said that it was very carnivalized. feathers, body cult, uncontrolled sexuality, open voluptuousness, polygamy, lack of subtlety, and at the same time, aggressive communication. And he was saying that he was missing a simple, mundane, humane image of LGBT people. So to Dominykas, simple, humane, and mundane stands in opposition to feathers, body cult, open voluptuousness, and uncontrolled sexuality. So in a way, I would say that he shares the same approach to sexuality as anti-pride protesters, basically, because that's what they were against as well. We don't want to see any, naked people running down the street and things like that. So in order to promote this simple, mundane, humane image of LGBT people, Dominykas started a project, a platform where LGBT people can share their stories. However, in the project, Dominykas uses particular rhetoric, and in his own words, he aimed at finding rhetoric that would not evoke resistance. So he aimed at talking about LGBT topics as if it was a simple, mundane issue without getting into legal discussions. One of my goals, he was saying when I was coming out, was not to talk in terms that everybody was already bored of. That kind of talking, I mean, the boring talking is related to activism with strong and aggressive demands, a critical stance. And he was saying that that does not help to create a connection with society. So basically he was aiming at empathy-focused rhetoric. And he was trying to avoid conflict with the society, not to elicit any conflict by downplaying the demands by the community and also downplaying any kind of very much LGBT related specificities about their lives, so kind of really making the conversation generic in a way. And he explains the choice of rhetoric as a tactic to win over the society by eliciting empathy, and in that way changing people's convictions about LGBT people. So he was saying, and this is a direct quote as well, that the fight for freedom and rights happens in many forms. And I think the most appropriate one is to win over your opponents in such a way that they would not even understand that they were won over, to change their attitudes. I think it is very damaging to talk from an arrogant perspective, from the perspective of a victim, from the perspective of a fighter, from the perspective of a scientist or of a preacher. But we try to talk in a way that would elicit empathy in people, not by some theoretical slogans or theoretical discussions whether LGBT is good or bad. So I think that the aforementioned activists aim at creating an LGBT image that would show that LGBT people are no different from the rest of society in terms of their values. And as they share the same values, and in particular values related to sexual conduct, modesty, appropriateness, and so on, the LGBT people are legitimate members of Lithuanian nation and citizenship. And that's why I kind of call these kind of strategies of inclusion. It could be argued that these strategies actually succumb to oppressive religious and ethnic ideologies, which are proposed by nationalist groups and politicians, which is rather than trying to overturn them. And they also comply with the existing division of sexuality and civil rights. They're kind of reinforcing this division that sexuality is a private matter and politics and rights is a different thing, and these shouldn't get mixed up. It also could be argued that the strategies undermine the original purpose of Pride marches and LGBT visibility projects as it is understood in the West, which is to challenge existing puritanical norms and to celebrate sexuality rather than to comply to already existing ideas about it. However, there were some changes in societal attitudes about same-sex partnerships and also attitudes about the Pride. For example, in 2010, so when the first Pride was organized, there was about 200 participants and a very strong and violent opposition. So these are the photos at the bottom. In contrast, in 2019, Baltic Pride had at least 8,000 participants and a dozen of peaceful and civilized anti-Pride protesters. So these are the photos on the top. And Pride is also becoming more joyful, carnivalesque, and there is more costumes and things like that. So I think it's also like changing its shape a little bit. In terms of societal attitudes, in 2015, over 83% of the population were against any kind of same-sex partnerships. In 2019, however, the number of the respondents who were against same-sex partnerships dropped to 66%, which is still quite a very high number, but I would think in basically 4 years, it's quite a significant drop. I also just saw in the news that the parliament will discuss the question of same-sex partnerships in Lithuania in the next couple of months. And also we have an openly gay member of parliament in Lithuania at the moment. So these are the changes that have happened in the last 12 years, basically. So basically, this is kind of just some of my ideas, and they are really not worked over very well. And some kind of my questions for further inquiry into this LGBT politics in Lithuania is kind of, I'm wondering to what extent, if at all, these strategies of inclusion that I was discussing contributed to lesser opposition towards Baltic Pride events and also to increased acceptance of same-sex partnerships. And I was also wondering, does it make any kind of tangible impact on LGBT rights movement in Lithuania in terms of legislations and rights, which, well, I just found out today that probably it is, because the parliament is going to discuss the question. And I think probably the most worrisome question for me is what happens within this context, what happens to all the left out aspects of LGBT image, to what happens to these people who are actually not presented, who do not fit into this appropriate, modest, controlled sexuality image of LGBT people. So this is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rasa. I have a few questioners on the list. Please, if you'd like to be on the question list, send me a chat message as well. Let me pose one initial question to you. I think many of us have watched this new out member of parliament in Lithuania, Tomas Raskievičius. And could you tell us a little bit more about him and the reaction to him? Because from the outside, it does look as though he is, quite flamboyant. He embraces his sexual orientation very strongly. He's a very out, proud, gay man in many of the terms that you've sort of suggested were being somewhat sidelined within the movement or the attitudes. So his presence, I know he's only one person, but his presence in parliament, what's been his experience and what are the reactions to him in his visibility?
Okay, so Tomas Vytautas Raškevičius, he first, he's been in politics for quite a few years now. He was first a member of the council in the capital, like local government, and then he was elected to the parliament with the party. So he's a member of the party who is considered like probably in Lithuanian context, the most progressive and the most liberal, like holding most liberal views in general. In terms of his flamboyance, I think it also shows like the shifts and the changes that are kind of happening in the society, from what I understand, because like, I mean, I don't think he would have been elected 10 years ago. So I think it also showing this like this change in the society, how people kind of stop being afraid of LGBT, and like they're becoming more relaxed. And I mean, now you can have a bit more diverse expression of your sexuality or yourself in general, and it is not considered dangerous to the country or the integrity of the nation. So I think this is it just shows like this shift that it has happened within Lithuanian society to a certain extent. Yeah, because like basically before 2010, there was basically there was a void in terms of discourse about LGBT in general whatsoever. So you didn't have any TV personalities that were gay. You didn't have nobody public, and there was no articles or nothing happening at all. So when the first Pride was organized, basically, or they started to organize the first Pride, the anti-LGBT organizations was kind of started to say, but you know, just go and look into Amsterdam Pride. Do you want all this debauchery here? Because there are all these people who want to go in the streets and run naked. And because there was no other kind of ideas about what LGBT people are, a lot of people really took this kind of anti-LGBT propaganda, I would say, to heart. And that way it was such a big kind of negative reaction towards the prides. But I think because of that, I mean, these prides are comparatively really mild in Lithuania in terms of like expression, celebration, things like that. I think people kind of get more like, as a society, got a bit more relaxed. And yeah, so it is changing into like more relaxed, more positive, and more also in terms of self-expression, it's changing for the best. I think, I mean, because Tomas Vytautas was elected, so I mean, people knew from the beginning that he was gay and they still elected him. Recently, there was some kind of, maybe I'm going into too much detail. I mean, there was some kind of online bullying towards him because, again, now this whole, what we had like 10 years ago, like LGBT, like Baltic prides will destroy the nation. Now we have exactly the same argument about Istanbul Convention in Lithuania. So basically, Lithuania wanted to ratify, like the parliament wanted to ratify Istanbul Convention that protects women from domestic violence, basically. It's somehow by the same group of anti-LGBT and anti-anything progressive people, was explained to the society that now everybody will have to raise their children without gender, and people will come and take away your children, and you know, all these things, so we cannot ratify this convention, and Tomas Vytautas is to blame for that. So there was some kind of backlash against him regarding that, exactly in the same terms that it was about gay prides and things like that. So that's how it is now, and we'll see where it will go. But he was elected in the first place. I mean, the country voted for him and his party. So
thank you. That's really useful. Let me call Pippa Cattrall.
Thank you very much. That was a very rich paper and gave me lots of food for thought. What you've just been talking about in response to Andy puts me in mind of the concept of usualizing. And it seems to me that that's the strategy that you're describing here of trying to reduce that resistance because of the unfamiliarity and also, of course, its association with a significant other, the West, in this instance. So a lot of the stereotypes you're describing as being in play in Lithuania now are historically ones which you can find in the West 30, 40, 50 years ago. I mean, if you look at Britain in the 1960s, all of those stereotypes operate in a very Protestant, well, a much more Protestant society. So I don't think it's necessarily linked to a particular form of religiosity in this structure. The question I wanted to ask, it takes you back to that point about significant others, I couldn't help noticing that in the Pride March in 2019, people were carrying a European flag. And of course, part of what's happening in the with the disassociation of the Baltic republics from the Soviet Union is saying, actually, we're part of the West. We're not associated with those people over there, although clearly some people are. I couldn't help noticing the horrible anti-Semitic element in that image you put up earlier. One aspect of that disassociation with the East is, of course, Putin's massive homophobia. So is there a way in which the LGBTQ movement in Lithuania could actually play on that and start exploring a way in which we can say, well, actually, this is a way of disassociating ourselves with the Russians?
I think, in fact, it is. Actually, people do that very much so when they explain the changes in the society that I noticed. So I collected autobiographical interviews, and I'm asking people, so have you noticed any changes within society, and how did your life change over the last 20 years, for example? And majority of my research participants, like, they always make the reference moving from the Soviet, moving towards the West, and Lithuania as being something in between, moving towards there. So when they say, oh yes, our society is becoming more open and more flexible and more accepting, they're saying, because we are part of the EU, people can go there now and they see other people, they see this diversity, and they become diverse themselves. And every time when they encounter some kind of homophobia, which is also very interesting, because I mean, homophobia is a universal phenomenon, isn't it? Like homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, etc. But quite a lot of people that I spoke to, for example, when they talk about how their parents don't accept them, they say quite a lot of them victimize their parents, and they say, like, you know, they were brought up under this horribly, horribly oppressive system. It was so difficult to have your own opinion about anything. They were all brainwashed. So basically, these people who are homophobic, especially the older generations, they are the victims of the oppressive regime. So it's not kind of their own personality and their own belief system, but these are, I mean, they were brainwashed by the communist, by the Soviet government, basically. So you are right that I haven't seen that kind of argument used so much explicitly by LGBT activists in terms of saying, look, we need to move away from the Soviets and move towards the West, and therefore we need to be more accepting. But quite a lot of people explain their own personal experience and the changes that they see in the country, like that the country is moving, it's getting more westernized, it's becoming more European through the contact with other European countries, through the ability of traveling and of meeting other people. And homophobia, they explain homophobia quite often as, you know, a remnant of the Soviet past. Also internalized homophobia, like quite a lot of people told me that, oh, you know, I struggled so much to acknowledge myself that I am gay or lesbian. And I would ask, like, so why is that so? They would say, oh, you know, because I still, you know, first 10 years of my life, I was brought up under Soviet Lithuania, and I think that was the impact on me, that I can't be myself, I have to follow the patterns and everybody's rules and so on, so I can't be original, I can't be myself, I can't be who I am. So this is, yeah, kind of this dichotomy between the West and the Soviet past is quite present in many people's autobiographies, the one that I collected.
Okay, the next question goes to Phil Ayoub.
Hi, Rasa. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really a pleasure to hear it and get an update on Lithuania. I have two kind of just short questions. I was, you know, obviously very interested in this idea between the link between religion and nation, which we see in the region, obviously with Richard's work too in Latvia and down south in Poland as well, where kind of LGBT people and movements are framed as foreign. And then one of the strategies to respond is to kind of root the movement back in the nation with these kind of strategies. And the Poles had this strategy. For example, they rolled out this campaign in 2016 called the Let Us Show Each Other a Sign of Peace, which was showing these kind of hands interlinked, the Catholic Church and a LGBT activist. And I know that, you know, KPH rolled that out also at a lot of international summits. And I'm wondering if LGL or activists are working, are any of the folks you're talking to saying they're working with other activists in other countries to come up with these strategies or inspired by them? And so that would be kind of the first question. Are there any international dynamics, given that the response, you know, sounds similar to what's going on in other countries? And then the other question, which is also inspired by the Polish movement, is do these strategies of, you know, quote unquote inclusion provoke then kind of fractures in the movement where other groups, queer groups, might say that we're actually being left out because, you know, these kind of, you know, respectability politics around, you know, making peace with the Catholic Church or, you know, presenting in a certain way, leave out people who don't fit. And I think that dovetails a little with Andy's question. Do you then have kind of LGL representing, you know, one wing of the movement using these kind of strategies, but leaving behind other groups that might push against it? I'm wondering if in the last 10 years, anything like that has happened in Lithuania, or is the movement still very cohesive because of the general you know, hostile context that it's in? Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for the questions. In terms of international collaboration, nobody has told me explicitly that they actually, you know, liaison with Polish movement or any other movements to develop strategies like strategies of resistance or strategies of inclusion. So it kind of feels that they come up with that on their own. But I guess because all these countries have quite a similar context, so, you know, they kind of reach out for similar conclusions. Actually, interestingly, I spoke to a person who used to live in Poland, and I asked for like his opinion, like about the difference between Lithuania and Poland in terms of LGBT, in terms of his life, just simply put it. So in his opinion, in like LGBT movement in Poland, like there is much more opposition and much more collision between like anti-LGBT and LGBT. And in his opinion, I mean, I'm not sure because I don't know much about the Polish movement, but what he was telling me that like the anti-LGBT is really, really organized there. And therefore, like the clashes are much stronger, whereas in Lithuania, in his opinion, they're like more mild. Well, I have to say, like, we'll see what the next Pride brings. But if you go to a Pride, you basically, like the first Pride was really, really scary. So you would have like 3,000 people with bricks waiting to hit you, like, and it was in 2010. And after that, like if the last Pride, you wouldn't see any opposition. You would see maybe 3 people who would say, you know, this is not a family or something like that. But I mean, they're expressing their opinion. It's a free country, you can express your opinion, but they're doing it in a respectful way. They don't, you know, and there's like 8,000 of people with flags and music is playing and so forth. So there is no such a kind of collision. There is no such a feeling anymore during the Pride, at least, that, you know, it's us versus them and we are fighting for the space. It feels like they won the space, or they at least temporarily have won it. And the second question about like the fractions within the movement, again, because kind of my PhD is not exactly about the politics and the movement, so I haven't spent that much time with like organizations and the movement. So I can, like, my opinion could be very shallow, and maybe some people will listen to this and says that I'm talking nonsense, but I don't really think that there is a very unified, coherent movement as such. I just think that there are different groups. So one of them is LGL, it's like kind of most prominent, and they do most of this kind of hard work in putting the Pride together and things like that. And then there are other smaller groups, like for example, like Dominikas Vaitiekūnas, he's basically, I would think, more or less works by himself, or he just finds a few people and does a project. Then there is this other group of lesbian women who do these parties, but it's not like some kind of, there is not so much communication or working together. The only thing is that they kind of use the same strategy. So it feels like, oh, there is a unified front against the society, but actually it's more like separate groups, but they kind of have similar ideas of what kind of LGBT image needs to be put out there. Well, that's my impression. But as I said, I'm more like, I basically go around Lithuania and collect autobiographies. That's my core kind of, research. And this was kind of a side thing that came up, and I thought, oh, that's also interesting about this kind of inclusion and promoting certain kind of image. And like the people that I was talking about, I would say that they are the most prominent ones in terms of like spreading the word about LGBT to the larger population. There aren't any really, really vocal activist groups that would advocate a different kind of position. I mean, this is not to say that there aren't people who think that way. I mean, there is a YouTube channel, for example, and they kind of root for more gender non-conformative lesbian visibility. So there is a few girls who they do this channel, but I mean, not many people follow the channel, or even if they follow the channel, it's not that they really speak out to the broader audiences. There are smaller kind of parties, but they are also more I wouldn't say like groups of friends, but very much like kind of on this kind of interpersonal kind of level, that circles of artists who kind of also have a bit different idea about sexuality, and that sexuality is fluid, for example, that the gender is purely a social concept and they don't adhere to it. But this very, very local and on a very, very kind of personal level, works within certain circles, certain intimate circles, basically, rather than kind of a political strategy, an opposing political strategy that would create some kind of discourse about different kinds of images of LGBT. But again, maybe somebody else who's more familiar with NGOs in Lithuania could tell you more.
Thank you, Rasa. Thank you so much.
Next up, Baroness Barker.
Hello, thank you so much for your presentation. I was lucky enough to go to Baltic Pride in Riga in 2018 and to meet representatives of LGL and Mosaica when I was there, and to listen to their very moving stories about the first ever Lithuanian Pride. They marched 100 meters and it was the longest 100 meters of their life. Yeah. And to move forward to the point in 2018 where I was part of a bigger pride that had about 8,000 people on it, and it only got tear gassed once. Let's put it that. So there's, that's progress. But I want to explain to people who are on the call please don't take this amiss, but if one goes and looks at the geopolitical situation of the Baltic states, you understand a tremendous amount about how the national story since the fall of the Berlin Wall is still a very keenly felt part of everybody's identity. That's the first point. Second point, I think you and I are both sitting in London, which I think is the second largest Lithuanian city in the world, is it not?
I think it's in Chicago, actually. But
it's Chicago, so I think we're third. The point that I'm making is the large number of Lithuanian people and young people who live and work elsewhere, who maintain their love for Lithuania, but who go abroad. So I wonder whether the experience, the political experience that you're talking about now, is a reflection of a deep concern and loyalty about about nationhood and solidarity, plus the experience of going to other places where, for example, in the United Kingdom, we have reached a level of legal equality and social discourse, which has meant that being LGB, if not T, is a very normal and usual part of everybody's life. So I wonder whether those two things have had an impact on those activists, because I have to say that both Mosaica and LGL, I think, have been incredibly good strategically in their thinking to have got to the point where they have got to now.
Yes, I was thinking about it as well. So I think that is one of the bigger questions that I have now, like to what extent these particular strategic strategies of the NGOs helped to change attitudes in Lithuania, and to what extent like Europeanization and migration in general. It's hard to measure, but like I would think that the migration has been always happening like to the UK and to the Western Europe since Lithuania has joined the EU. I mean, I don't think that more people have migrated within the last 7 years, so to speak, than before that. I mean, but the change is in the last 7 or so years, 10 years, is huge in terms of attitudes towards LGBT. So to a certain extent, I think, yes, definitely just exposure to like, you know, LGBT people elsewhere, people leaving the country, coming back, having more contact, all that probably influenced it as well. But as I say, like, I mean, migration has been always happening, and this change just happened throughout the 10 years. So whether it's kind of a cumulative, it's probably just some kind of cumulative effect of all these variables that came together as well. It's very hard to say. I think that's why I kind of find it difficult to kind of formulate an argument about these activities, because how can I measure the impact of policies towards the society? How can you take into account all the variables that actually influence the general opinion of people, and like which of the variables is like made the bigger impact? So is that what you were asking? Did I understand it correctly?
Yes, I think so. Yeah. I mean,
what the kind of exposure to the West helps to change Lithuanians' attitudes as well?
Yes. I mean, you could also talk about the extent to which the economic advantages of not being discriminatory have been picked up in society as well, that sort of thing.
Well, I mean, I haven't heard anybody mention that kind of argument that, yes, I see that, you know, the progress comes through equality, and, you know, we're all better off if we kind of respect equality and we are more inclusive. I haven't heard it voiced out much, like this kind of economic argument that, you know, we need to become, yeah, I don't know, but it's something to think about. Thank you.
And next up is Pancho Mulungeni.
Hello, hello. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yep, we can hear you. Can you hear us, Pancho?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, my question is very simple. In terms of variables that you can use to track progress of policy change, one of them, of course, would be the disproportionate burden that gay men who have sex with men have, HIV burden. I mean, I was just looking at the data. It's about 1 in 20 estimated among men who have sex with men, compared to 1 in 500 overall for Lithuania. And the infection per year hasn't really decreased since 2015. It's just stabilized. So my one question is, you never mentioned this public health aspect, and has this been a discourse that has been used at all of HIV prevention, that let us just do what is best to prevent loss of life, and that means we have to allow people to enter into stable relationships, because obviously if they're in stable relationships, they're not going to go around in the back door and, you know, anything they can get and put themselves at risk. I'm just curious if that's even a part of the discourse. Thank you.
No, actually. I know the statistics as well, but interestingly enough, HIV, like in public discourse, well, I have never seen it being associated with gay men in Lithuania, interestingly. I might be wrong as well, because as I say, it's not exactly what I like work on mostly, but I think that is also just my kind of idea why it is like that. Because, like, for example, when I learned about HIV at school, like in the late 90s, LGBT and same-sex sexuality was such a taboo that it was kind of never included into this whole discourse about HIV. So HIV was always associated with intravenom drugs and prostitution. So I think this is kind of the general idea how primarily you would get AIDS in Lithuania. If you would ask a random Lithuanian passerby, they would say, where does HIV come from? They would say, oh yeah, the truck drivers just get hooked up with the prostitutions on the road, you know, prostitutes on the road, that kind of idea, I think. Rather than they would say, oh yeah, gay men spread HIV. And I never read any kind of, yeah, I never heard anybody from LGBT NGOs also talking about this kind of, oh yeah, we need to like, you know, promote monogamy because that would help to stop HIV. When I spoke to gay men in Lithuania, I mean, yeah, they are very well aware about HIV and the dangers, and they know that. I mean, they can get it, and it happens in the community and things like that. But I don't think that in like the public consciousness, like in Lithuania, HIV and homosexuality, like and gay men is linked very strongly. And I still think that because like talking about LGBT was such a taboo in the 90s when the talking about AIDS, HIV started, that they kind of just spoke about drugs and prostitution because that was kind of, I guess, less of a taboo to discuss the topic rather than, I mean, because like gay men were didn't exist in that kind of discourse, in that kind of conversation. From what I remember from my own kind of education and upbringing and from what I see. I mean, gay men, I think, are still not allowed to donate blood in Lithuania because this is automatically assumed that, you know, they would like, they can be HIV positive. So there is this, I know that they have this kind of rule, which they're trying also to remove. But in terms of like a general discourse that you would find, for example, in the UK, that HIV, like if you think about HIV, you would definitely think about gay men and men having sex with men and things like that. I don't think that an average Lithuanian would think like that about HIV.
Thank you, Rasa, and thank you for all the questioners. I think one of the great mysteries of life is why you in the Slavic and East European studies are sitting next to a map of Morocco or Tunisia. But I'm not even going to pursue that weird geographical quirk of history. Thank you, everybody. I want to remind you again that next week we have a webinar on the experiences of women who identify as bisexual in parliamentary office. So Katie Hill, Nadia Whitome, the Labour member for Nottingham East, Senator Anna Hui, who is from the Agricultural Panel in the Senate of Ireland, and Delaware State Senator Sarah McBride, who is the most senior transgender person in elected office in America today. I will send you the link in the regular registration format and forward that widely to anybody you wish to. So thank you all for joining us, and keep well, keep safe, and we'll see you next week. Thank you, Rasa.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.